Welcome back, everyone, to another Accelerating Success Forum. I'm your host, once again, Greg Levy. I'm an Associate Dean at the University of Miami Law School and Director of Entertainment Arts and Sports Law Program. Couldn't think of a more timely topic than today than to talk about student-athlete or athlete-student. We have an incredible panel today for our conversation. I'm going to briefly introduce them and we're going to get started. First, Maddie Solomon. Maddie is an attorney, athlete advocate, and speaker. She's a legal analyst for Speaking of Athletes. She creator and legal analyst for WYE Channel. Lawyer, played lacrosse at Duke University, graduated from UNC Law School, and was the former chair of the NCAA Division I Student Athlete Advisory Committee. So thanks so much for joining us today, Maddie.
Thanks for having me.
Next up is Jay Billish. You know Jay is a lawyer and college basketball analyst for ESPN. Billish played college basketball at Duke and serves as an assistant under Coach K. He received his JD from Duke Law School, and he currently also serves as of counsel to Moore and Van Allen, where he maintains his litigation practice. So Jay, thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
And last but not least, Ricky Vellante. Ricky is the CEO and co-founder of the Professional Collegiate League, PCL. He's also an attorney at the Vellante Law Firm, where he focuses on issues related to professional and amateur sports, as well as intellectual property law. Thanks so much for joining us, Ricky.
Thanks for having me, Greg.
So first, we're going to dive right in. We're going to just talk about the model of the NCAA and why do we have the NCAA? It's funny, when you look at the background, I think the first collegiate athletic competition was a boat race between Harvard and Yale in 1850 or something like that. And the railroad executive who sponsored the event was doing it to promote train travel to, I think, a lake in New Hampshire. And the competitors got, expenses paid and I think alcohol and all this other stuff, and seemed to come a long way from that. So why do we have the NCAA? Jay, do you want to start?
Well, I mean, you need to have a governing body. I think there's a lot of people out there that probably misconstrue this, but the NCAA in many ways is great. They do a good job of administering eligibility rules for the most part. They run great championships. They do a great job of making money. But just like any business or industry that has monopoly power in its area, in its market, it just has to behave a certain way. Like the monopoly power of the NCAA is not going away. It's just the question of its behavior. And I think the biggest issue that I've had with the NCAA and policy since I was a player, frankly, and I was on the NCAA's long range planning committee in the 80s, was how the athlete was treated. That the only person in the entire industry that's restricted in any way in what they can earn or accept is the athlete. And I've never felt that was fair. If individual schools do what you want, but as a cartel, the NCAA is a collection of schools that compete and conferences that compete against one another. They can't have horizontal price fixing. To me, it's not that difficult. And finally, the courts have caught up to it. It took them a long time, but finally the courts have caught up to it.
So, Maddie, do you have any additional thoughts on that? I mean, you also were a student athlete. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it was an organization that was created to protect the health and safety of athletes, and that's never been one of its focuses. And I think that it's going to be an important one moving forward. And I hope that, a lot of the conversations that have taken place in the last, several months and year will kind of move it in that direction. But I think that the NCAA does some good things, like Jay mentioned. But part of the problem is, where all of the power is. And it isn't in the hands of the athletes. And one of the biggest issues is that athletes really have no bargaining power in the whole system. And it's why you get rules that are really, geared towards competitive balance, whatever that really is, and not really towards protecting the safety and the interests of the athletes. And, and that's really where I think the NCAA goes astray a lot of times, is that it is more focused on maintaining its control, maintaining, its revenue, and less on creating rules that are really going to help athletes if it doesn't help their bottom line ultimately.
Ricky, you've obviously created, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, an alternative model, to the NCAA. So what are your thoughts about like where was the NCAA kind of failing?
Well, I think as Maddie and Jay already touched on, the NCAA lost its way throughout the course of the 20th century. Originally when it was created to stop the litany of deaths that was happening in college football was a good thing to start with, but along the way it became about power, money, greed, as unfortunately these things can. I think the only thing I would add, in addition to what has already been said, is that the NCAA in a lot of ways acts at the behest of the member institutions. They kind of provide each other with cover where schools can point to the NCAA and say it's the big bad NCAA, and the NCAA can say it's just acting on behalf of the schools. So, it's very similar to how professional sports leagues use the commissioner's office to sort of shift the blame from one to the other, depending on the circumstance.
Ricky, that's a great point, and it serves to make this point. When I say NCAA, I'm talking about all the member institutions. That the NCAA, I try to make the distinction about when I'm critical of the NCAA office in Indianapolis and maybe Mark Emmert and his lack of leadership and competence, whatever, and the NCAA policy, which is all the members and conferences. When a conference makes $1, I say it's NCAA, because that's all part of the same whole to me. So that's a good distinction to make.
And I think to add on as well, I mean, there are some really amazing people within the structure, but I think as a whole, in terms of how it functions as a system, I think that's where you have most of the problems. It's not necessarily the individual actors all the time. It's how collectively decisions are made and the athletes are kind of left out.
Now we use this term student athlete, or we've been programmed to use this term, and some people will say that's an oxymoron, and it's really, you're an athlete and then you have some classes on the side. I'll start with Maddie, with you. I mean, what are your thoughts that can education and college athletics coexist? And obviously you were on the NCAA, you chair the NCAA Student Athlete Advisory Committee. So thoughts on that?
I mean, can they? Yeah, they can. But that takes, I think, an effort on the part of all of the schools and everyone involved within the organization to place an emphasis there. And you just, I mean, over time, the trend has been really away from focusing on athletes as students, except when it serves them to remind everybody that they're getting a scholarship and that this is about education. But the fact that athletes can't take whatever class they want, they're limited in terms of even attending office hours. They miss a ton of class. They miss a ton of class for NCAA championships. And even things like being able to complete a degree and just the way that coaches really expect the athletes to be focused on their sport and make everything work and stay eligible. But ultimately, the emphasis isn't on taking advantage of everything your institution offers in terms of education. And that's fine to some degree, but we need to be honest about that. And I think if we really want to trend back towards it being a focus on education, then there needs to be a serious discussion about how much time athletes spend dedicated to their sports and their ability to maybe even miss practice sometimes, to attend office hours or lectures or other things that are outside of the realm of athletics. So I think, can they coexist? Absolutely. And different people can take advantage of different things, but the fact that athletes are so limited is problematic in terms of if you're going to say that it's about education.
So Jay, the NCAA's, I think it's 98.2% of athletes will go pro in their sport or something like that. And NCAA is trying to sell us on this scholarship as compensation. But are we failing those students when they're done? And do they not? I mean, I went to Michigan, I went to law school here, and I wasn't an athlete, and I know that friends of mine who were did not get the same education that I did.
Yeah, I mean, yes and no is the answer to your question. I mean, initially, first of all, there's no such thing as student athlete. It's a made-up term that Walter Byers and his merry band came up with to try to avoid paying workers' compensation claims. We don't use such terms in any other aspect of university life, and why we have to categorize things or prioritize things to say, well, there's student first who just happens to be an athlete. That's just frankly stupid. Like I don't have to say, I'm a parent first who happens to be a spouse and then a lawyer. Like I don't have to prioritize all the things that I do. Different people have different priorities, and that includes students. Like every student on a campus has their priorities in different order, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But to Maddie's point, to me, I think these are all great discussions that each school should have on its own campus and decide what it's about. How long do we want our players to practice? Do we want them? I don't think the NCAA should put in a rule that says every athlete has to have a semester abroad. Why? I mean, if they want to, go. If an individual school wants to do that, then do it. Same thing with practice limits and Maddie's point about office hours. Those are great. So if Duke wants to do that and North Carolina doesn't, fine. To me, that's sort of the freedom that each institution should have, because we don't have controls in any area of the business except on the athlete. And I think that's profoundly wrong. We've proven that this is an entertainment industry. The pandemic proved that. We've proved that athletes, they can coexist, but this idea that the scholarship is compensation, that's nonsense. It's not compensation, because more non-athlete students get scholarships than athletes. And we don't call that compensation, and we don't limit anything else that those non-athlete students can earn or accept. So we've sort of created this fictional universe for athletes to live in, and tried to justify the how big the business is and what we're doing by saying, look, we're limiting their practice time, and we're doing this, and we're protecting them here, and we're protecting them from exploitation. While the truth is we're actually exploiting them. And that's starting to change. And I think that's a good thing, that we're getting more toward individual schools being able to decide what's best for their athletes. And if they don't want to do it, then don't do it. But, hey, the door is open for Division II and Division III. We've always told the athlete, if you don't like it, go pro. But now we need to tell the schools, hey, if you don't like dealing with the athlete fairly, then you can get out of the business.
Mm-hmm. Ricky, NCAA has always wanted to hold on to this concept of amateurism and the way they defined it. What are your thoughts on that? And I mean, maybe tell the audience a little bit what they try to, make amateurism out to be, and why it's such a protected thing for the NCAA.
Yeah, amateurism has had an interesting history. I know the NCAA originally tried to tie it back to the Greek Olympics, it's just false. That, in fact, if you look at the Greek language and you look at the word amateur, it loosely translates to fool. It means that you're not good at something. So amateurism started in England in the mid-19th century, and then came over to the US in the early 20th century in the context of collegiate athletics, and in particular during the rise of the NCAA. And it really has been used as a means for this economic cartel to monopolize the revenues generated by college sports. I mean, that's what it comes down to. And it's been one of the biggest and most successful marketing ploys, I think, in all of sports, maybe even in all of business in the US, because we have still a huge contingent of our society that believes that college athletes, if they're not amateurs, then the sports will be, less pure, or whatever that means. So amateurism today, or rather prior to the Alston decision coming down on Monday, meant, a full cost of attendance scholarship. Anything past that, you're no longer considered an amateur. I think today, the NCAA and their statements yesterday would seem to suggest that cost of attendance plus name, image, and likeness payments from third parties is still a form of amateurism. It's a new form of amateurism. But as long as the athlete is not being directly compensated for their athletic reputation and performance, I think that's really what it comes down to for the NCAA and the amateurism marketing ploy that they're trying to sell.
So let's turn to Alston. So Jay, I'm going to turn to you first, particularly for the non-lawyers in the audience. Can you just break down the significance of the Alston case?
Well, it was the significance is huge. It was a monumental loss for the NCAA. There are some that call it a limited ruling, and it's limited in a certain way, but it has broad implications. So this was the first time that the NCAA had been before the United States Supreme Court since the Board of Regents case in 1984. And the Board of Regents case was about what was the schools suing the NCAA for antitrust violations, when the NCAA, in its infinite wisdom, was telling schools how often they could be on television so that they could preserve gate receipts and wouldn't flood the market with television. So what we've seen now is in Alston are it was limited in what the plaintiffs were asking for. They were asking for relief on the academic side to have, so there would be no cap on academic benefits that they could receive. So if it was a laptop, as a lot of people are talking about, or paid internship, tutoring, to get a semester abroad paid for, things like that. So that cap is now gone. But what's also gone, when the NCAA petitioned the Supreme Court for review, what's also gone is the deference that the NCAA received from the courts all these years from that Board of Regents ruling. There was dicta in there that said that they would get, that the NCAA should get basically broad deference, even a presumption that their amateurism rules are pro-competitive. Now they have to go by the rule of reason test. And I believe that even though that this is limited, that both Justice Gorsuch's opinion and then Justice Kavanaugh's concurring opinion make it open season on NIL rules and on compensation directly from the university. That it basically, to me, indicated that the court does not believe that the NCAA can justify its policies with regard to money to athletes. And I think it was a profoundly stupid decision by the NCAA to take this to the Supreme Court, because the lower court ruling in the Ninth Circuit was actually very favorable to the NCAA. They didn't get everything, but I don't know whether it was hubris or just rank incompetence. It might have been both, that made them say, we're not going to be told what to do in this space. Like, nobody gets to tell us how to pass our rules and what we can restrict with regard to an athlete. And even though they had a lot of protection still on the amateurism side, they put that up for grabs. And frankly, they got their rear ends handed to them. And I think we're seeing the beginning of the end of amateurism altogether. And to Ricky's earlier point, amateurism is, for the NCAA, is and always has been whatever they say it is at any given time. And now, like, they have, Mark Emmert specifically under oath has said that if players were to ever get their NIL rights, they would be professionals and shills for products. Well, if they're professionals because they have NIL rights, then why should they be limited in any way if that bright line is now blurred? So I think this is the beginning of the end of amateurism, and the NCAA is going to be a professional entity, or the players are going to be professional, except they have to be students. That's the only thing that makes college sports different from anything else, is the players are students. They're full-time students, and they have to be in good standing, and that's it. The rest of it is as professional gets.
And Maddie, Jay hit on the concurring opinion, and wanted to see if you could maybe dive a little deeper into that, the significance of that concurrence, and what Justice Kavanaugh really had to say, and kind of almost sent a warning out there, right?
Yeah, I mean, he definitely sent a warning. His last line was, "The NCAA is not above the law." And he virtually broke down every argument that the NCAA has relied on. And I want to underscore the significance of the Board of Regents case. I mean, that also was a case that the NCAA lost. But like this one, I think, the NCAA likes to play on words. And they picked on some words that they had been using from the opinion to really say more than the court ever said. And I think we definitively now have a ruling from the Supreme Court saying, no, that's not ever what we said. You were never supposed to get this extreme deference. Your rules are not valid as a matter of law. And absolutely, you can be challenged under antitrust and anything else. So I think, it's definitely an indication of what arguments will work, where the court is leaning. I think that there are some important things that will need to be addressed. And I think that the concurrence also signaled some of that, because in the same token that Kavanaugh was sort of saying, look, all of your arguments are crap, he also said, okay, in the event that we do at some future point in time decide that your other compensation rules are also illegal, we will have to answer some important questions. And he kind of outlines, Title IX and how the pay would be, divvied up in terms of if you actually paid players. So I think that it signals some consideration of future things. And he also touches upon, they're interpreting the law as it exists now. If at some future point, if Congress were to, say, grant the NCAA an exemption of some sort, that would change how this would be interpreted in the future. And he also mentions if there is collective bargaining on behalf of players, that also further changes the argument. And so I think it's interesting. I think that the NCAA will definitely take the language from the main opinion from Gorsuch and say, like, look, we're still allowed to make rules about our educational related expenses and all this stuff. And they may do that, but they can still be challenged on it. And I think that it does definitely open up the doors for a lot of lawsuits, which I have to say I don't necessarily like that as the path towards meaningful and needed change, because I think you can look at how much money is completely wasted on attorneys' fees that is not going to the athletes while the NCAA continues to fight against athletes. So I hope that this opinion serves as some, guiding post for the NCAA. I think that may be giving them maybe perhaps too much credit, but for them to really take a hard look and start doing things that are actually in the best interest of athletes across the board. But I think that remains to be seen. But they'll definitely be challenged on their rules moving forward.
Ricky, on a very practical level, can you tell us, like, okay, let's just say you're Duke or UNC. What are some of these educational benefits that now you can expand? Jay alluded to some of them, but how will schools try to make themselves more competitive than their peers?
Yeah, I think that what you're going to see is somewhat of a race, as we've seen, like with venues and coaches' salaries and all these permissible things where schools can induce recruiting decisions, even if the schools don't want to call it that. I think we're going to see a race to creating robust internship programs, aligning the tech community, having an internship program with an Amazon or an Apple, Duke and UNC. I'm pretty sure there's a big Apple secondary headquarters coming to the Raleigh area, if I'm not mistaken. So, having a relationship with Apple now going forward with some nice paid internships, of course, in no way, shape, or form tied to their athletic performance or reputation, will be something that we see. I think also Jay already alluded to laptops and those sorts of postgraduate degrees, though I don't know how far postgraduate degrees are really going to get in the recruiting context. Most of these, at least in the revenue sports, most of these athletes are looking for the quickest way to reach the professional ranks. So offering them more schooling, I don't know how much that's really going to factor into their calculus when it comes to deciding where they're going to go ultimately. But I mean, it's going to be those sorts of things. What does educational related compensation mean? And I think we're going to see the NCAA most likely seek clarification from Judge Wilkin in the Northern District of California in the coming weeks, so that they can get some sort of indication. Because the last thing the schools and the NCAA are going to want is to start to put into effect certain educational related compensation rules that are just going to instantly be challenged in the court. They're going to try to, I think, at least in this limited context, try to avoid being dragged back into the court in the near future. Now, that said, to Maddie's last point about how she hopes the NCAA is going to take this as sort of a guiding light going forward, pulling out a quote from a memo that was distributed with the NCAA yesterday. While certainly disappointed with some elements of the Alston ruling, the court did not alter the core elements of college sports. So clearly, no one told the NCAA that amateurism is dead. No one told the NCAA that they've lost really any power going forward. So I think we're still in for a long, drawn-out battle. Alston took 9 years from its initial creation to working its way through the Supreme Court. So I mean, if we stick to that sort of timeline, we're looking at potentially the early 2030s before meaningful change through litigation. But legislation is definitely on the table in the near future.
Yeah, the problem the NCAA has is now there are going to be money damages on the line for all these antitrust violations, and as everybody here knows, those damages are trebled under the Sherman Antitrust Act. So, look, the stuff about increased academic benefits are going to be very much like the stipend. If you'll recall, when the stipend was first passed, there was the same sort of doomsday talk from NCAA people that women's sports are going to be hurt, sports are going to be cut, budgets are going to be impacted, competitive balance is going to be affected. And none of that was true. And schools have a pretty wide latitude to value their cost of attendance the way they want to. They apply a value to their housing that is way above what it would be on the open market, and then they just give the money to their players. Their players go off campus and get a cheaper apartment and pocket all the money. So it's a factor in recruiting, but it's not the whole factor. Just like it is for coaches. If the NCAA is now going to go back to Congress, and instead of on bended knee, they're going to be on both knees, begging Congress to do its job for it. And say, please give us an antitrust exemption, even though we are a serial antitrust violator, and allow us to continue to do what we've been doing over the years. I don't think that's going to work, but there is some appetite by Congress to give a uniform standard. The problem the NCAA is going to have is, in the short run, before Congress can act, the sky is not going to fall. And the world will remain on its axis, and we will see that having differing state laws isn't that big of a deal, because the NCAA never ran to Congress and said, wait a minute, there are differing tax laws in all these different states. And it is unfair that we're competing for coaches in this market when Florida, Texas, and Nevada have no state income tax. All the best coaches are going to flock to those areas. They never did that. And it's not a big deal to have differing state laws with regard to NIL. If a state feels it's not competitive with their current NIL laws, they can change their laws. That's what competition looks like. So I'd be really surprised if Congress gives the NCAA any sort of antitrust protection in this, but we'll see.
Maddie, can you talk a little bit about Title IX as it relates to this decision? And we briefly mentioned that before, but how do you see Title IX being implicated here, if at all?
I mean, look, when it comes to benefits that are provided by a school that accepts federal funding, they're supposed to comply with Title IX. Now, do they? Absolutely not. And I think really even a lot of the conversation around NIL, separate and apart from the decision, has been this emphasis on, well, how is this going to affect female athletes? How is this going to affect non-revenue sports? Are resources going to be distributed equally? And I think that that's an area that attention needs to be paid to. But Title IX hasn't been enforced. It's definitely implicated when it comes to schools providing these resources. But, it's going to be definitely highlighted a lot more when it comes to NIL, because while schools are devoting resources to media and advertising and the resources that they put into training athletes, building their brand, all that stuff, they need to be spending equally across the board on all athletes. And I think that there's been contemplation in some of the state laws. You've heard it at the congressional level talking about NIL and talking about Title IX. The problem isn't, creating a new enforcement mechanism. It's enforcing the law that's already in place right now. And that needs to be done. And the fact that it hasn't for so many years, I think has held women's sports back, because the level of investment has not been put into building them up. And, there hasn't been the same emphasis put on what revenue they're bringing in. And the NCAA throws their sports in for free in their contracts. And we've seen the more that any organization invests into women's sports, they have a following. There is demand for their sport. But I think with all of this, there's going to need to be an increased focus on, are the resources being devoted, equitably between men's and women's sports? And, again, that's got to be enforced.
So we'll jump to NIL now. I'm sure everybody in the audience is aware, but so college athletes monetizing their name, image, and likeness rights. I think July 1st, we're at 7 states now, I believe, with Kentucky, that have state legislation to allow athletes on July 1st to monetize their name, image, and likeness rights. Everybody's been waiting for a response from the NCAA, which, not surprisingly, has been very slow. There was a legislative-ish approach, but now it seems like they're pushing more towards this permissive approach, where if state doesn't have legislation, it's going to be up to the university to come up with their own guidelines. It won't be a violation of NCAA rules, so long as essentially athletes are not being paid to go to the school. Jay, what do we think about that permissive approach, and why on earth, given how long we've been talking about this, has the NCAA not been able to figure this out before 7 days or 5 days before it goes into effect?
Yeah, I think, Greg, the short answer is they didn't want to. They've never wanted to allow this. The NCAA has always been sort of this idea of permissive legislation, which implies, if not outright states, that the athlete starts at zero, and then we'll decide how little we can give the athlete. I've likened it to a faucet, that the rest of the world, and that's literal, the rest of the world in college athletics drinks out of an open faucet. And with athletes, we start with zero, and we talk about how many drips do we want to allow the athlete. So with NIL, this is a huge departure for the NCAA. NIL, from a philosophical standpoint, down to the bedrock principle of amateurism, violates everything the NCAA has ever been about. The idea that players would be allowed to accept money for their name, image, and likeness having to do with their athletic reputation is, to use Mark Emmert's favorite word, antithetical to everything the NCAA has ever been about. And so, before October of 2019, Mark Emmert was out there saying that name, image, and likeness is an existential threat to the NCAA. And then in October, they said, well, we're unanimously going to go forward with this. They've been dragging their feet the whole time, but California and then other states really showing what competition looks like have passed all these rules. To me, now all we're talking about are guardrails. What we need, the appropriate guardrails. We have to have like it's an athletic contest that has to have specific rules. You step out of bounds, it's my ball, all that kind of stuff. And we don't have those. We don't have those guardrails with regard to literally any other person in the business. So the NCAA is right now, because of the Alston ruling, afraid to put any rules out there that are going to be restrictive in any way. So they're leaving it to the schools, leaving it to the states. That's fine. They ought to just do that anyway and just say athletes have the same economic rights as everybody else. Each school, do as you will do. And let's get this over with, because ultimately that's where we're going to wind up. The rest of us and every other business has to comply with federal law, state laws. I mean, with all the crying the NCAA and all the member institutions, you wonder how they ever get a building built. Like, how do they deal with OSHA regulations and building codes and contractors and subcontractors? Like, it's so complicated. How are we going to put this building up? On the revenue side, we never ask any of these questions. The only question is when money's going to go to an athlete, then we have to get it down to the penny, and we have to worry about all these doomsday scenarios. And I've always felt it's nonsense, and it's I think it's being exposed as such now.
Maddie, thoughts on what this NIL system should look like?
I think that Jay's right. And I think having there be more competition between schools, I think it can be governed at the conference level. I think that would make sense. Conferences compete with each other. They can set their own rules. And then at least you have some unity within the conference and some clarity there. I think, you insert all of the state laws, and I think that the NCAA could have gotten ahead of a lot of that initially by just saying, okay, we're going to allow conferences to make their own rules. And I think you wouldn't have seen as many states jumping in. The reason we now have the added layer of states and an additional push to want to have Congress jump in on this issue is because the NCAA didn't act. And it's exactly what Jay said, that the NCAA wanted to wait to the last minute. I think they were pulling at strings. They were hoping for anything that was going to give them a little bit of leeway. And if they had gotten that in Alston, we wouldn't even see them handing it down to the schools to make their own rules right now. If they could restrict it in any way. And even when they handed it down to schools, it was still with some guardrail saying, well, we want you to keep it to the collegiate model and not have it akin to pay for play, whatever you decide to allow your athletes to do. But again, we've gotten into this place where everybody feels like it's going to be chaotic because it's the 11th hour. And now all of a sudden they're handing it to schools who could have otherwise had months to actually come up with, a thoughtful decision on how they're going to allow their athletes to take advantage of it. Because a lot of the schools have been thinking that it's going to look like what the NCAA had been working on. They're 30 pages worth, of proposals, which is insane. It's insane for something that it can easily be covered by contract law. Most of this stuff, this is not overly complicated stuff. And when you talk about wanting the schools to be in the business of reviewing athlete contracts, that's absurd. You take care of some of the things that they're concerned about by just having a conflicts clause within the contracts, within anything that they sign with the school. And you don't need to worry about, the schools being allowed to nitpick everything in an athlete's contract and see an athlete's contract and potentially be able to compete with them in some way or have, an edge in negotiations because they see all of the contracts from their athletes. So, those are the things I have a huge problem with in all of this. And it's in some of the state laws. I hope in the event that there's a federal law, it doesn't make its way there. But it's schools wanting to still control too much. And to another point, I think if you're going to have morals clauses where athletes can't contract with alcohol companies and gambling companies, fine, cool. But the schools need to abide by these same rules. So if it's a problem for athletes, it should be a problem for any institution that is sending a message to all of its fans that it's great to gamble. But again, one standard for everybody. It shouldn't be this double standard for athletes.
Jay, I'm going to circle back to you really quick. So also from a legal perspective, wouldn't the schools want to not be involved in this? Aren't they potentially creating more liability for themselves if they're getting involved in the nitty gritty and reviewing and getting involved in what these athletes are doing outside in their own endorsements?
Yes, especially in light of the Alston decision, all of the sort of restrictions they're putting on, I think will ultimately be struck down at some point. And to Maddie's earlier point, I would prefer that the NCAA addressed all this stuff themselves, and we didn't have to do it through the court system or through state and federal legislation. But that's not been a reality. Look, I happen to think this is really simple, and I may be in the minority there because the NCAA has made it so complicated over the last 100 some years of its existence. But really, the only thing the NCAA should be worried about is, are you enrolled as a full-time student in good standing? The rest is up to the individual schools. And as Maddie pointed out correctly, the conferences. The NCAA is not a league. It is a collection of competitive leagues. So the Southeastern Conference, the ACC, the Big Ten, all the others, they're their own little NFLs and NBAs. And they're competing against one another for media rights dollars, for apparel contracts, for talent on the field and off. So they can make their own rules, and the NCAA just needs to deal with the broad strokes, put the championships on, and deal with whether they're full-time students. And that's the end of it, because we've proven that money and education are not mutually exclusive. We've proven it with regard to every non-athlete student, and now we're proving it with regard to athletes. And once they allow NIL, that said, they were professional. The NCAA said that makes you a professional. So you can't just kind of back up after all the court cases they've had in the past, all the things they've said under oath, and then pretend that didn't happen. Courts are going to take that into account. And they are also, to both, Ricky and Maddie's points before, like, even though Kavanaugh's concurrence is not binding, it has authority. And look how long the NCAA was able to rely on dicta. And they don't think, like the NCAA thinks that they still have protection. They don't. I mean, reasonable minds can differ on this, but it may take a while, but it's over. And they'd better start acting like it, because they're not going to be able to do what they've done all these years. It's over.
Ricky, what about agents? How do agents play into this? I know there's been some conversation around that. I know there's been concern, I know, from the NCAA that all of a sudden, if agents are around college athletes, it's going to all of a sudden, change the world. But what role should agents have in this? Should we even care?
I mean, agents were already involved. We can all tell ourselves what we want, but the agents were already there. Most of the state rules, and from what it looks like, from what Nicole Auerbach at The Athletic was just reporting about an hour ago on this 50-state all-school memo that's gone out from the NCAA, it looks like agents will be able to participate as long as it is limited to an endorsement agreement, which, again, I don't know how you can realistically enforce that in a vacuum. I mean, to think that I'm not going to call out any specific agent's name. To think that a particular agent is going to work with an athlete strictly on endorsement and never discuss their future playing career is ridiculous. They are going to be building that now. It just moves the recruiting period for the agents up to the age of 18. So to again try to create this sort of false fake regulation, I mean, it just goes back to the continuous over-regulation. I think when you get to NIL, it's simple. I think it's maybe even more simple than Jay and Maddie were saying. If it's not impermissible under federal or state law, it's not permissible. Otherwise, it's permissible. That should be it. There shouldn't be no conflict language. If Bryce Harper is an Under Armour player, Major League Baseball is a Nike contract. They coexist on the field together, while Bryce, last time I checked, no fan refuses to go to a Phillies game because Bryce Harper's wearing Under Armour cleats and a Nike jersey. So I think that it's a continuous issue where within collegiate athletics, which I think gets to one of the broader issues of why we do this, it's always overregulated. There are always too many rules. I think that Senator Chris Murphy is doing a really good job, at least with his proposals, where his unionization collective bargaining proposal is 2 pages long. His NIL proposal is 3 pages long. That's what it should be. Senator Cory Booker and Senator Blumenthal put forth a 67-page pseudo CBA piece of legislation, which again gets back to paternalism versus empowerment. We should be empowering the athletes in the same way that professional athletes are empowered to seek endorsement opportunities with limited restrictions, as long as they're not going against state or federal law.
Yeah, Ricky, and your point about Bryce Harper is a great one. But I think we all know the reason why the NCAA is looking at that differently, and that's because they look at it as a zero-sum game. That every dollar that goes to an athlete is a dollar that they're not putting in their pocket. The NCAA, and by that again I mean the member institutions, they think that's all their money, and so that the athletes are going to get their money. That they're the ones that should be getting all that. That's why the stuff about competitive, that you can't have a conflicting deal. If Duke's got a contract with Nike, and it does, great. That doesn't mean Zion Williamson can't wear Under Armour. He should be allowed to do that, or have a conflicting hamburger deal. So what? And the thing about agents, the players should be allowed agents whenever they want. The NCAA doesn't step in and tell players and their families, all right, here are the doctors you can seek advice from if you don't like the doctors that are on staff at your university. We'd never tell somebody that, but yet we want to tell them, whether they can seek advice from a lawyer or an agent with regard to money. This is all about protecting their money. And I've never agreed with it. I never thought it was the right thing. And now I think in light of Alston, a lot of people are looking at this differently, and they should.
And I think it speaks a lot to how the NCAA has felt just entitled to tell athletes what to do and to completely control their lives. And I think they see very clearly with athletes realizing that they have rights and they're speaking out, that this is a new world for them, that they don't just get to boss them around, take advantage of them, and really profit in any way that they want to. And I also think that they're very short-sighted in the way that they look at any of this, because I think that having athletes more involved in the marketplace, engaging with fans in different ways, especially some of the sports that don't get as much attention, is only going to grow their pie and everybody involved. And so I think even in terms of thinking about it as there's only this limited amount, that if any of it is diverted to the athletes, there's not enough to go around. And that's just false.
Jay, do you think that this backs up to high school? And what I mean by that now is, a lot of times, I mean, high school players, like let's say you're a star Friday Night Lights player in Texas, should you be able to now take an endorsement deal? And you obviously do that because you wanted to stay eligible for college. But I don't think that the high school federations are going to stop that. Do you?
No, but that's up to the high school federations, and they can do it their way. And that's I think, Greg, that's a really good question, but it's not one that impacts the decisions of the NCAA or the member institutions. They shouldn't be worried about, like, the biggest sort of criticism I've had is we've kind of approached, we being the college sports space, have approached this. On one hand, we're purposefully and intentionally making this as big of a professional enterprise as we can, as far as revenue generation, the way we sell it, media rights deals, all that stuff. And then on the other hand, with regard to the athlete, we want to pretend like it's the Little League World Series and they're being coached by their dad, who's an insurance salesman, and we put it on television at the end of the season, but not during the season, all that stuff. That's not the way this is. So, I do hear that a lot. People say, well, what's next? You want to pay high school kids? As if that's the issue here. It's really not. And now, do things trickle down when the NCAA has purposefully and intentionally turned this into a multi-billion-dollar entertainment industry? Like, look, the pandemic showed this beyond discussion. We played ball not because the kids want to play during the pandemic. That wasn't it. That may have been a fifth or sixth or seventh on the list. But number one was the NCAA owed media companies content. And if they didn't provide the content, they weren't going to make money. So when they say the kids want to play, I was asking the question, name me a non-athlete student that a university put on an airplane during the pandemic for a university function. And you can't name one. So those kids wanted to play in their endeavors too. And they didn't get to. Because this was about content, and it was about money, and it was about business, and that's okay. But the high school space is different. The college space is a separate and distinct market that is monopolized by the NCAA. And the question isn't do they have monopoly power? They do, and the court, the Supreme Court just said that, and definitively. The question is their behavior as a monopolistic cartel. And they've got, to Maddie's point, they got to change their behavior. I don't know that, I think they know it. I just think in the short run, they're trying to preserve it as best they can. But I think they know it's over, and they're going to have to figure out how to behave going forward so that they're not back in court every 5 minutes, which they're going to be.
Maddie,
one thing I'll add.
Yeah, go ahead,
Greg. One thing I'll add there that is an interesting rule coming out of Florida in their NIL policy, and some of these things that we've been talking about, NCAA versus state, like the no conflict policy has filtered its way into most of the state NIL bills. So whether it's because of the NCAA's lobbying efforts or whatever, the states believe that these no conflict policies should exist, at least the majority of them that have put forth legislation. The other thing I will say about Florida, though, getting to your point about high school, is that there is an interesting way that they've worded this where an endorsement deal cannot be further in time than the term of their scholarship. So depending on how you interpret that, that might mean that if you've signed an endorsement deal prior to coming to college, you might still be ineligible because that extends beyond the term of your scholarship opportunity. So, I mean, that's the problem with some of these bills, is that, like, what does that mean? How do we enforce this? How is it going to be enforced? And what is the ultimate interpretation of a clause like that?
Thanks, Maddie. So I wanted to say, isn't there a huge opportunity here? We talk about education and college athletes not getting the education when they come out, right? But now they're going to have their own businesses. They're going to be their own CEOs. We're in this creator economy where these amazing examples of athletes who are just constantly creating, right? Isn't it on the institutions now to take this and say, hey, this is a real opportunity. Let's use this to teach and help the athletes and learn about business and learn about, entity formation and intellectual property and contracts and things of that nature.
Yeah, I mean, I think it always has been. I think one of the biggest excuses that's bothered me, the most in all of this is initially when you're talking about NIL, schools are pushing back saying, well, these athletes don't know what to do. They're going to be taken advantage of. They don't know how to file their taxes and all this stuff. Like, but you're an educational institution. Teach them. You have professors, you have courses. This shouldn't be hard. And that can't be an excuse. And I think it's a tremendous opportunity for these athletes to learn life skills. I mean, on all the topics that you just mentioned, and to learn it while they still have some protection and some support over and above trying to do something on their own as well. And so, yeah, I think it's a tremendous opportunity. I think it's been interesting. I've heard some suggestions that NIL become a major. And when you really think about it, there's so much that goes into that. I mean, it's intellectual property. It's all the things that are relevant to living in a more media-driven social media world. And these are athletes who have grown up inundated with social media, and they're seeing their friends be influencers. They're seeing all the different possibilities of being creative and creating their own things. And so absolutely empower them. I think stripping them of that, it's almost even more egregious this day and age because they're seeing what is being taken away. And I think the pandemic had an interesting way of highlighting a lot of that because they realized that there was strength in using their voice and calling out what was really going on an institutional level. So I think it's a tremendous opportunity for them to learn and grow and be more prepared coming out of college. And I think this is stuff that should be taught at a high school level if we really want to talk about the educational side of it. But certainly these athletes should be prepared. I think students across the university should be prepared in these various ways, handling budgets, all sorts of things.
I don't think it should be compulsory, though. That's the one thing I will say, because we do not, if Sergey Brin and those guys that started Google out of Stanford, we didn't require anything of them from an academic or an educational standpoint. We didn't. And this is getting back to what I was saying earlier in terms of the real issue here, which is the majority of the athletes that are going to most benefit from NIL are going to be minorities. And I think that's why we are really trying to over-regulate this space and why this paternalistic approach continues to exist.
And I think one of the things that the universities are going to find out in pretty short order is that there are going to be a lot of revenue streams that are going to open up if the university marks and the player name and likenesses can be used together. And so I think we're going to see that change in the future, especially once athletes and with representation become more aware of their market power. Athletes are going to be pushing back saying, hey, when you're trying to market our team with university commercial partners, you can't use our likeness without compensation. So we're going to see, I really believe we're going to see that change and evolve, and you're going to see player name and likenesses and university marks allowed to be used going forward, because that's where there's going to be more revenue available. And if the NCAA shown one thing, they will venture where revenue is, and I believe they'll go there.
Yeah, and I think to add to that too, I think it's athletes are going to push for more fairness along the lines as well. And you saw that when you saw it with Sedona Prince during the basketball tournament. But what's interesting about that is nobody was shocked by that, and I think that it was touched on in the congressional hearing. Female athletes, and I think others, assume that things are not going to be fair between male and female athletes. When my team went to a Final Four, it was nothing like what the men's Final Four was. And so I hope that needle continues to move, because it has been like that forever.
Ricky, I want to just quickly turn to alternative models. Obviously, you're the co-founder and CEO of the PCL. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you're doing at the PCL, and how do you think that the PCL, is an alternative because the NCAA didn't have these revenue opportunities? How do you think that changes what you're doing now that they will? NCAA will?
Yeah, so the super short version of the PCL is kind of summarizing what we've talked about today, which is that we're focusing on what is best for the athlete. So providing scholarships in addition to actual direct compensation. Our athletes will be employees and not student athletes. So therefore, they will have workers' compensation policies. They will have the typical medical benefit policies that any employee has. They'll also, by virtue of being employees, have the right to unionize and collectively bargain with us. And we intend to voluntarily recognize a players' union for our players. So, really all the things that we've been talking about today is what the PCL has been championing now for the last several years. There have been others that have now also entered the space. We've got the G League Ignite team that's compensating players, though in a very discreet way, where it's only about 5 players a year that they're signing. We also have Overtime that's now introduced the OTE, or Overtime Elite League, which is focused on 16 to 18-year-old high school players, and in a lot of ways resembles what we have set out to do at the collegiate level. So I think that there are 4 ways to ultimately take down an economic cartel: litigation, legislation, unionization, and competition. We've seen unionization fail. Maybe it won't in the future, but to date, it hasn't been successful. Litigation, it's a complicated, winding road, and will continue to be. Legislation, we'll see what ends up happening for the rest of this year. But I think that you've seen a number of groups, and not just the PCL, determine that there is a market opportunity here, with or without NIL rights, to enter this space, provide a legitimately equitable opportunity for college athletes, and allow them to be treated the way they should be, which is full-fledged citizens with their complete economic rights intact.
So, Jay, with a lot of these are in the basketball space that we've seen, right, with PCL, Overtime, and G League Ignite. Do you think that now that things are going to start opening up in the NCAA, is that going to push people more towards college who may have considered some of these alternatives, or do you think there's space for everything?
Well, there's clearly, in my view, space for everything, but I think there's going to have to be a little bit of a mindset change on the part of the NCAA, the member institutions, the conferences. My perspective on this has been the NCAA comes at this with a sort of an arrogant and elitist viewpoint. That at least in the basketball area, if you're not going to be Bill Bradley or Shane Battier, the NCAA gives off an air that we don't want you at all. And I think that's a really crappy way to go about things when you're trying to claim that education is of paramount importance. So we should be welcoming young people to college and helping them to achieve their dreams and get an education. So whether it's the OTE or the G League Ignite, whatever it is, playing overseas, going into the draft. I mean, my selling point, if I were the NCAA, would be you can achieve all those dreams, but we'd like you to come to college, even if it's only for a year. Establish a relationship with an institution of higher learning. They will want to have you back. That school will want you to come back and finish your education. There's no time limit on this, but come to college. You may wind up staying longer than you think initially, but you'll have more options. If we think education is so important, and I do, but that's not been the mindset we've used, and the reason is it's because of money. The NCAA's wanted to protect its money, and they felt like if we don't have to deal with the Zion Williamsons of the world, then we're not going to get as much pushback on money, and I think it's been a backwards view of things. No matter where the best players go, the NCAA still is violating federal antitrust law by not allowing the athletes that do come their way to, as Ricky put it, be full. Like, I love that, full-fledged citizens. Like, why can't they be full-fledged citizens? That's a great way to put it. And so that's where I think we're headed. Like, the NCAA's got competition. That's a good thing, but it just needs to act appropriately within its market. I hate to keep saying the same thing, but it does not act appropriately. It's been violating the law forever. And now that it's been called out on it, they can't claim they've not been on notice.
With the 1 minute we have left, I'll just go quickly around to the group. Maddie, what does the NCAA look like in 10 years?
Gosh, in 10 years, if I could predict that, I mean, I think I think we're going to see, I think NIL is going to do a lot. I think we're going to see a shift towards athletes really being involved and more vocal. I hope by that point, there's going to be a system in place that, athletes really are able to argue, advocate on behalf of themselves and bargain on their behalves. And I hope, I don't know. I think you're going to see a very different looking model. I think you're going to see a lot of the old guard out and a lot of people who are, I think by that point, focused on empowering the athletes. And I think that's been missing this whole time, is this idea of actually empowering athletes and looking at what they can do, and not just expecting them to simply be athletes. And I think that overall focus is going to shift a lot of things within the structure.
Ricky?
I think we're at least in store for another 10 years of the NCAA fighting tooth and nail to keep everything as close to it currently is as possible. I don't think the NCAA is going to have an awakening over this case. I don't think there's anything on the table that they're going to have an internal awakening about. External forces may require change at some point, whether that's the courts, Congress, or competitors. But I think the NCAA is going to do everything in its power to keep things as close to as it looks today as possible.
Jay, final word.
I think it'll be strikingly similar to what we see now, with the exceptions of athletes being allowed to make money. And multi-billion-dollar businesses don't just fold up because they have to allow their workers compensation. It's not going anywhere. And college athletics isn't going anywhere. It's too profitable. So we're not going to see that change. The change we may see is the Power Five and a few others may form their own division within the NCAA structure. But the reason we're not going to see, in my view, we're not going to see them break away is because everybody knows where their money's coming from now. And so I don't think they're going to want to, disrupt, sort of that money flow for that sort of control. But we're also not going to see a bunch of schools opt out of Division I, because the universities, whether they be big or small, are using athletics for institutional advancement as much as they are for revenue generation. So there are a whole bunch of reasons they're doing this. It all comes down to money in one way or another. But we're not going to see, to Ricky's point, we're not going to see the NCAA go away. They're not going to, because everybody's making too much money, and that's in a lot of ways that's a good thing.
Maddie, Jay, Ricky, thanks so much for taking the time. Thanks for everyone for joining us for the Accelerated Success Forum. And it's an exciting time to be thinking, talking, and learning about this space. So we'll see you again soon. Everybody have a great weekend.
You too. Thanks everybody.
Take care, y'all.